My name is Federica Fragapane, and I'm an information designer, and I work as a freelancer designing data visualizations. And in the past few years, I've collaborated with different magazines and organizations. I worked with BBC, Science Focus, Google, United Nations, the Scientific magazine, Scientific American, and I also collaborated with La Lettura, that is the cultural supplement of the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera. And the range of complexity that characterizes my projects can be very broad according to the needs, the usage context and the readers, and also the levels of experimentation that I use. But in general, what I'm interested in exploring is this communication, communication connection that the data visualization piece can create with the people it talks to. I'm particularly interested in exploring this connection and in this communication, exploring this communication process. And as I was mentioning, many of my projects have an experimental approach, and they allowed me to mix visual experimentation and a sense and on a deep care for aesthetics and meaningful contents, of course, at the same time. And the role of aesthetics as a significant role in my approach to designing data visualizations. I don't work with deep care on the aesthetics of my pieces just because I like pretty things, even if I enjoy looking at pretty things. But it's because for me, it's really part of this communication process I want to work on. I really want to invite the readers into looking at my pieces, into exploring them when the usage context allows it. So there are cases in which I know that I can work on complex pieces with a certain level of experimentation, maybe because the usage context is characterized by a slow reading process, for instance. But anyway, this is just to talk about the role of the shapes and the forms that I'm using. And this is also something that I'm going to talk about now. For me, designing data visualizations is really an act similar to the writing one. I'm writing with visual alphabets and often also experimenting with new visual letters. And I think that as in writing, also in data visualization, the choice of visual words has a role in communicating stories. And I want to show you some examples and how, for me, designing data visualizations can really help in communicating topics, and for me, how the form of my visual words have a meaningful role in to do it. So to show you a first example, I collaborated with Scientific American, the Scientific magazine, and there is something that I really love about this collaboration is the fact that when Scientific American proposed me to visualize a topic, they not only send me the material, the data for the visualization itself, but also contextual papers and information that could be interesting in connection with the subject I'm talking about. And some years ago, they contacted me asking me to visualize the menstrual cycle, visualizing it. And apart from all the actual data that then I visualized, they also sent me a very interesting paper. It was this one, The Menstrual Cycle, a Feminist Lifespan Perspective. And the paper mentioned how the stigma and the taboo that in media and in communication surrounded and still surrounds the topic, and how, for instance, in movies, in media, the subject of menstruations was historically connected with something ugly and dirty, ugly to look at. And reading this paper meaningfully influenced my approach to the project, because I really wanted to work on something aesthetically pleasing, also in contrast with the taboo and with that stigma. So I want to show you in this case quickly the project. So the project shows the menstrual cycle, the variables involved, and their connection. And I really worked in this case deeply with deep care on the aesthetic of it, influenced by the paper and by the role of the aesthetics of the forms that I'm working with. And there is a few years ago, a potential clients of mine described my visualizations using these terms, fragile languages, and I really love it. I really love this description, actually. And it allows me to talk about fragility. And the fragility is not only the fragility of the shapes that I'm using, but I think also the data fragility. And I think that as a data visualization designer is an important subject to talk about. I'm going to show you another example. So 25th of November is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And a couple of years ago, I wanted to create something thinking about this day, this annual day, this International Day. And as I often do, I often propose the topics when I work with clients. In this case, it was just a personal project, side project without any commission. I looked online for data sets. So my own language is visualizing data. So when I want to talk about a subject, I usually look for data about such subject. And in this case, I use as source the OECD, and I visualize the topic of the prevalence in the lifetime. So the percentage of women who suffer from sexual abuse from an intimate partner in a moment of their lifetime. And so this was the data set that I was starting from, the source, and the source provided the data for all the world's countries, almost all the world's countries. And in this case, I wanted to create a pretty straightforward, yet organic representation. And I use these shapes made of curved red lines, in which each curved line shows 1%. So the number of red lines shows the percentage of women who have experienced physical and or sexual violence from an intimate partner at some time in their life. And then I visualize the data for all the countries that the data sets provided. And then I posted it online on my social media in this case. As I was mentioning, it wasn't for a client. And this topic and this project allows me to talk about the fragility. So those shapes are fragile because of different reasons. First of all, because of the fragility they are telling. So the stories, the human fragility behind them. But then because those data are fragile too, because a number such as the prevalence of violence, the number of women who suffered from sexual or physical violence from an intimate partner, of course, it's not a number that you can count precisely. Maybe you can get very close, you can have an overall idea, but inevitably we are going to lose hundreds of stories maybe. And I think that this is very important. I really believe in the communicative potential of visualizing numbers, but I think that it's important to have the intellectually honesty and transparency, and to declare that the data are fragile too, can be fragile too. Behind the data, behind my visualization, there is a human intervention, and it's mine, but there is a human intervention behind data too. And I think that it's very important to declare it with transparency and intellectual honesty. Yet, I still believe that visualizing such numbers, giving a shape to such stories can be a very good starting point for starting a conversation, helping people in discovering something new, talking about subjects, and also starting maybe a conversation about the missing data and the missing stories, for instance. So, of course, I still believe in the role of visualizing this data and these stories. And again, coming back to the idea of visual words and visual alphabets, I was mentioning how the shape for me of visual words has a role in communicating stories. And I often use organic shapes, and this is a definition of organic from Oxford Languages, relating to or derived from living matter. And I think that designing organic shapes helps me, and hopefully also the readers, in reminding the lives behind the data. I mean, I often talk about data that have human lives behind them. As in this case, for instance, this piece was a data visualization designed for the online magazine Atmos, and it shows the patterns of violence for Brazil's land defenders. So the average proportion and number of environmental defender deaths in Brazil from 2015 to 2019 by state. And in this case, the clients asked me to use my usual organic style to talk about these stories, reminding of the lives behind these numbers and behind this data. In talking about organic shapes that have stories behind them, I want to talk about another project that is called Key Workers. So in 2020, I was contacted by ODI in March, April 2020. ODI is a think tank, and they were started collecting the stories that you can see here in this screenshot. Stories of migrants and essential workers' contribution to the COVID-19 response. And they were just starting collecting these stories as a personal initiative. And they created this dataset that is still online and publicly available. And for each story, they added information on the geography, on the country, on the level. So if it was an initiative on a national, local, or regional level, the dataset collects both stories of contribution, but also on the initiatives supporting such contributions in a moment of crisis, such as the first months of the pandemic, and not only that moment. And then other information such as the sector, agriculture, or healthcare, for instance, plus other contextual data and information that can be helpful if added. And they contacted me because they had this very long data set, but they wanted to give it a shape because they thought it wasn't enough to communicate such stories. And they didn't want something proving a point. They just wanted a website allowing the readers to explore these stories without a specific order, for instance. And this is why I worked on this project, and it's called Key Workers. It's a website. I co-designed it together with Alex Piacentini, who was an excellent UX UI designer and also developer, so he also developed the project. And it's the result of a collaboration with the ODI and ODI Smart Foresti. And we created for each macro region a tree, and the larger branches show sectors from healthcare to agriculture, and the local and the smaller branches show different levels from national, regional, or local. And the idea was really the one of giving a shape to these ideas, to this concept of growing awareness of this contribution. So this is why I wanted to use the visual metaphor of the tree. That is a very simple visual metaphor, actually, but it's again an organic one, because I really wanted to give a shape of this concept, not only of growing contribution coming from people who are in those countries, but the growing awareness, our growing awareness of these contributions. And the website allows to explore these stories. As you can see in the landing page, you can see all the trees, one for macro geographical area, and then interacting with them, you can see the stories. And this, for instance, is an old screenshot because this project was then updated and monthly, periodically. So now the trees are bigger. And they have more stories. And then clicking on them, clicking on the stories, clicking on the geographical region, you can see the tree with the screen split into axes. On the left side, you can see the tree, and on the right side, you can see the map with the stories plotted on it and categorized by sector. And then, of course, clicking on the story allows to read it and to also go to the original source. And so this was a project that I loved working on because it really allowed me to also to show how data visualization can really help in showing hidden stories and in bringing them to life. So I want to talk about another project quickly. And this is again connected to how I think data visualization can help us in visualizing stories and in bringing them to life. So I worked on it a few years ago in 2016, but it's still one of the projects I'm most fond of. I started thinking about, it was 2016, Italian media talked a lot about asylum seekers arriving in Italy and the Mediterranean sea routes. And I started thinking about how long actually their travelings were and how few I knew about all that part that was before the Mediterranean route. That is, yes, extremely dangerous, but there are thousands of kilometers before that part often and hundreds of days spent traveling. And so I started to think about how I would have liked to use my competencies to talk about these journeys, sharing people experience. So I contacted a welcoming center, and this is how I met MB, SS, MG, AL, SG, and TK. There are 6 asylum seekers arrived in Italy in 2016. And we worked together on a project that is called The Stories Behind the Line. My idea was to give a perceivable shape to their life experiences and to their journeys. So I met them in the welcoming center they were hosted into, and with the help of Google Maps, we reconstructed the routes point by point. And for each point, I asked them always the same questions: how many days they traveled together, the transportation, and how many days they stayed there before moving to the following place. Plus, I added that I would have noted down any additional notes and comments that they would have liked to add to their narrative. And this data collection process, of course, is very different from the other ones I'm used to. But it is because I really wanted, in this case, to exit from the digital bubble and also to immerse and to go out and to talk with the people who live the topic every day. Because I think that data visualization can have a role not only in communicating to people, but also into giving a voice to people who don't have platforms. And it is an important concept for me. I was a little bit intimidated on the fact that I was deciding to deal with a very complex global topic and also painful stories, showing very simple and personal data. But this is because I really wanted to provide a simple, clean, and personal and rational narrative of the topic, because I think that this is a topic that deserves a rational approach. And I think that a rational approach doesn't necessarily imply a lack of empathy. And after our meetings, I drew for each person a unique line shaped by the lived experiences. And an horizontal line show the days of traveling, blue for days of stays in the city, light blue for days spent traveling. And then I show the different transportation with dashed lines. And the final project is a website. It's called storiesbehind.com. Also, this project is the result of a collaboration with Alex Piacentini. He's a colleague and also a very dear friend of mine, and he accepted to work with me on this project that, again, has no commission. So we worked on it during the evenings, basically, and on the weekends. And in the landing page, you can see the 6 lines with the initials of the 6 narrators. And then interacting with them, clicking on them, you can see each single narrator's page. And I wanted each single story is very precious, and I wanted to give their lines their own space, showing them at first as black path on a white background. And then interacting with them, you can see the days spent traveling, going over with the mouse, you can read the data, you can also read the transportation data. And then those red dots represent the moments in which the narrators decided to share some little fragments from the stories, and clicking on them allows to read them. In this case, they just when they wanted and if they wanted. So there are lines that have no red dots, and it was completely fine, of course. And then I wanted to show the map behind the line, of course, that is very important. And clicking on map allows to see it. But I wanted it to be a second step. So you see the part within the circle is the Mediterranean Sea route, the one the Italian media most frequently mentioned, for instance. But I wanted to show all the part before that route. And I wanted it to be a discovery from a user's perspective, a user's point of view. And I think that this can be a way to deal with global and complex topics as the migration one. I think that, of course, it's important to talk about them, showing the big picture and visualizing big numbers and big data. But I think that also providing such small windows from which to explore the topics can help in having a deeper comprehension of it without losing sight of the humanities behind those stories and those data. Plus, as I was mentioning, I don't think that the rational approach implies a lack of empathy. And I think that the narrator's comments really helped me in adding a very emotional and meaningful layer to the project. A beautiful comment is the one by SG, 26-year-old boy from Pakistan, who told me, "My mind is quiet now. I'm quiet because I'm safe, and that's why I love Italy." And another beautiful comment is from AL. He was 17 years old at the time, and he told me, "You have a beautiful life here because you know that you're safe." So to conclude the talk, let's move to today. Today, this is a tweet from a Iranian friend and colleague, Maral, and she tweeted today marks a critical day for Iranians. Mahsa Amini died 40 days ago. Traditionally, we say our final goodbye on the 40th day after the passing of a loved one. And in this tweet, she's asking people to be Iranian people voice, as you can read. And this is something that she's been doing for weeks, actually. And I was looking at her stories on Instagram some weeks ago, a couple of weeks ago, and I was following what was happening in Iran and looking at her stories in which she was asking people to talk about the subject. I started to think that I wanted to talk about the subject using my visual languages. And so I started to look for data because, again, this is how I usually talk about different topics. And this is the one data that I found. It was October 2nd, and it was a data on the people who have died and been killed actually since the beginning of protests in Iran. And I decided to visualize the data with a very simple shape in which one line shows one person, and the shape recalls the braids, thinking about all these women who are fighting and were cutting their own hairs, their own braids, as a sign of protest and rebellion. And I posted online, and I was really overwhelmed by the hundreds of comments that I received and how much it was shared, and hundreds of comments from Iranian people asking again us and me to be their own voices. So unfortunately, I'm updating these visualizations because now the numbers are growing. This was from October 12th, and I also had to add a data that the source provided. The data is Iran human rights, and the data was on the children and teenagers killed. So I visualized this data adding white lines to show this number within the total number of people killed. And this is the last update. I published it yesterday. In this case, I also added a black braid that fits into the background because I wanted to point out to the fact that those numbers only include the verified ones, but there are, again, missing stories and missing numbers that are still under investigation. And yes, this is just one of the ways in which I want to use data visualization to talk about topics and subjects. And thank you very much for your attention.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, works. Perfect.
Okay.